Everybody starts this story in the same place, on a kitchen floor in Los Angeles in June of 1968. We are going to start it 23 years earlier, on a ski slope in Quebec, because that is where the actual story begins, and almost nobody bothers to go there. December of 1945, Mont Tremblant. Jean Kennedy has brought her college roommate along on a family skiing trip, a loud, fearless, entirely fearless 17-year-old named Ethel Skakel. Jean's brother Bobby is there too. He barely registers the girl at all, and there is a straightforward reason for that. He is courting her older sister. Hold that image, because it is the whole thing in miniature. A young woman standing at the edge of a family she desperately wants to be inside, watching a boy who is looking at somebody else. For roughly 2 years, Bobby Kennedy pursued Patricia Skakel, the prettier sister, the calmer one, while Ethel worked the margins of her own family, cracking jokes and organizing games, making herself impossible to ignore and remarkably easy to overlook at the same time. Only when Bobby and Pat drifted apart did he turn to the sister who had been auditioning the entire time. She got him second. She never once described it that way, and she spent the next 18 years making sure nobody else had a chance to either. Here's what the famous photograph does not tell you. It does not tell you that she was the consolation prize in her own marriage. It does not tell you that she came from a family richer than the Kennedys and spent her adult life pretending it barely existed, or that she buried her own relative scandals as thoroughly as she buried her husband's. And it does not tell you the strangest fact in the entire story, which is that the woman America pitied on that floor ended her life holding the one thing historians spent 40 years asking for and could not get their hands on. So the question this video is built around is not the usual one. Nobody needs to ask whether Ethel Kennedy loved her husband, because on the evidence, she loved him past the point of reason. The better question is the one the photograph makes almost impossible to see. Was she the passive half of a great man's story, the way the country decided within about 4 hours of his death? Or was she the person who eventually got to write it? Stick around, because the answer sits in a set of boxes rather than in the marriage, and it took half a century to become visible. To understand why a woman would spend 20 years trying to out-Kennedy the Kennedys, you first have to understand what she was running away from. The Skakels had more money than the Kennedys did, and considerably less control over themselves. George Skakel started out as a railroad clerk, earning $8 a week, and built Great Lakes Carbon into one of the largest privately held companies in the United States. In 1936, he installed his 7 children in a 31-room manor on Lake Avenue in Greenwich, Connecticut, and then, by most accounts, let them do more or less whatever they liked. Biographers who went back and interviewed the neighbors decades later described a household of guns, wrecked cars, serious drinking, and boys who treated an extremely respectable town as a private amusement park. Her father was a Protestant who kept a polite distance from the family's religion. Her mother, Anne, was a ferociously devout Catholic who drilled the faith into her daughters with no room left for negotiation. Ethel absorbed 2 rules early, and they governed everything that came afterwards. God was not up for discussion, and neither was anything embarrassing that happened inside the house. There's a detail from her school years that friends were still repeating decades later. Ethel gave serious thought to becoming a nun. That one arrives without a contemporary witness attached to it, so hold it lightly, but it fits everything else on the record. The girl famous for pranks and recklessness was also the most rigid Catholic in almost any room she walked into. Keep those 2 things side by side, because together they explain a marriage that outsiders would spend the rest of the century failing to explain. Her pursuit of Bobby Kennedy was not really a courtship. It was a campaign, and it was run with the thoroughness of someone who intended to win. In 1946, while he was still half attached to her sister, Ethel volunteered on Jack Kennedy's first congressional race and went knocking on doors in Boston for a family she had not yet joined. At Manhattanville, she wrote her senior thesis on Jack's book, Why England Slept. Sit with that one for a moment. She wrote her college thesis on a book by a man who was not yet her brother-in-law, about a family she had not yet married into. One hostile biography, published in 1994, goes further and claims her first crush was Jack himself. But that claim rests on friends who are never named, which puts it in the pile of things that cannot be checked. What is documented is more than enough. Before Bobby ever proposed, Ethel had studied the Kennedys the way other students study for an examination, and she had already decided which world she wanted to live in. Bobby was getting something out of the arrangement too. He was the seventh child, the runt of a very large litter, unathletic by the standards of a family that measured people by how they played touch football, permanently overshadowed by Joe Jr.'s ghost and by Jack's easy charm. Ethel believed in him with a ferocity nobody else was offering. Friends from those years remembered her as his loudest supporter well before he had done anything worth supporting. That devotion was completely genuine. It was also, in practical terms, her ticket through the door. Even the courtship carried its warnings for anyone inclined to read them. Bobby was awkward, moralistic, and slow to commit. Friends recalled the suitor so hesitant that the convent idea resurfaced in the middle of the relationship, and she reportedly joked that her real competition was not another girl, but God. However much that story has been polished in the retelling, the shape of the record is not in doubt. This was not a man swept off his feet. This was a man carefully concluding that the loud Skakel girl who worshipped him fitted the life his family was going to require of him. Her money did not hurt. Her Catholicism did not hurt. Her willingness to put herself entirely below him was the main attraction. They became engaged in February of 1950 and married on the 17th of June that year at St. Mary's Church in Greenwich, in front of a crowd appropriate to what it actually was. The Boston Globe printed the quiet part out loud, describing the match as the joining of two large fortunes. Not two families, not two hearts, two fortunes. The wedding itself previewed the following 4 decades with something close to cruelty. On the Kennedy side, there was discipline, choreography, and political usefulness. Jack served as best man and worked the reception like a campaign stop. On the Skakel side, according to several biographers, Ethel's brothers and their friends turned the celebration into a demolition derby of drunken pranks that mortified the bride in front of the very people she was trying to impress. She was marrying out of one chaotic dynasty into a colder and far better organized one, and the organized one was standing there watching her relatives with visible contempt. How much contempt is a matter of dispute. Jerry Oppenheimer's unauthorized biography, a hostile book built on hundreds of interviews and therefore something to weigh carefully rather than swallow, attributes a remark to Bobby about his in-laws, to the effect that if he were not married to Ethel, he would not give those people the time of day. Whether he ever said it in those words cannot be established. What can be established is her behavior, and her behavior suggests she believes something very like it. From the early 1950s onward, she oriented her entire existence toward Hyannisport and away from Greenwich. Oppenheimer's sources claim she effectively disowned the Skakels. The pattern of her public life supports the direction of travel, even if the phrasing is unprovable. Her family of birth simply evaporates out of her story. What replaced it was a system, and the system came with rules. Rule 1 was to produce. Rose Kennedy had 9 children. Ethel would eventually have 11, arriving at a rate of roughly 1 every 18 months from 1951 to 1968, as though fertility were a competitive sport. Inside that family, it was. Rule 2 was to serve the machine. In 1952, the young couple moved into a Boston rooming house so that Bobby could run Jack's Senate campaign, and Ethel, pregnant, organized the tea parties that put the candidate in front of thousands of women voters. Rule 3 was that your husband belonged to the family before he belonged to you. Bobby's career ran through Jack, and Jack's career ran through their father, and Ethel's job was to keep a household upright while the men were somewhere else being important. She did not resist a single line of this. She excelled at it, loudly, in a way that some of the in-laws found exhausting. The nickname she picked up inside the family circle tells you everything about her position in it. People said she was more Kennedy than the Kennedys. That is a compliment with a blade folded inside it. You only try that hard when everyone in the room knows you were not born there. It is worth looking closely at how the hierarchy worked at Hyannisport, because the compound was the family's real capital city. Old Joe Kennedy set the schedules, the expectations, and the political priorities. Rose set the religious temperature. The brothers competed at everything from sailing to touch football, and the wives were graded, informally but unmistakably, on enthusiasm and output. Ethel flourished exactly where Jackie visibly suffered. She threw herself into the games, memorized the family's private jokes, matched her mother-in-law prayer for prayer, and delivered grandchildren at a pace that delighted her father-in-law. But contemporary observers noticed what all that eagerness was costing her. She had no room of her own inside that world, no identity that had not been issued to her by the family, and no fallback if the family ever decided to withdraw its approval. Jackie could retreat into books and into Paris. Joan could retreat into music. Ethel had burned the road back to Greenwich. The Kennedys were not merely her in-laws. By the mid-1950s, they were the entire architecture holding her up. And then, in a single afternoon, the family she had been quietly leaving was destroyed. On the 3rd of October, 1955, a few months after Ethel delivered her 4th child, her parents' private plane went down near Union City, Oklahoma. Both of them were killed. This is the moment the marriage shows you what it actually was. There was no extended public mourning. There was no visible turn back toward Greenwich. Friends later described her grief as intense and almost entirely private, sealed away exactly as her mother had taught her that family matters ought to be sealed away. Within a year, she and Bobby were buying Hickory Hill, the 13-bedroom estate in McLean, Virginia, from Jack and Jackie, who were giving it up in the aftermath of Jackie's stillbirth. Look at what that actually means. Ethel took possession of the house where her sister-in-law's hopes had collapsed and turned it into the loudest address in Washington. If you want the precise moment the girl from Greenwich became the woman history remembers, it is there. Orphaned by the family she had distanced herself from, she doubled down on the family that was still only tolerating her. Hickory Hill is where the public myth got manufactured, and it is worth pausing to admire how good the product was. Newspapers and magazines presented America with a glorious circus. 11 children, a menagerie of horses and dogs, and, at one point, a sea lion. Touch football on the lawn, seminars where cabinet officials argued philosophy in the living room. Parties where fully dressed guests somehow ended up in the swimming pool. In 1962, the historian Arthur Schlesinger went into that pool in his suit, and Washington talked about it for weeks. Ethel was cast as the anti-Jackie, unpretentious and fun and fertile and devout, and the country ate it up. Voters loved it. The family loved it. Reporters loved being invited. Now look at what was standing behind the photographs. The man of the house was almost never in the house. Through the McClellan Committee years and then as Attorney General, Bobby kept hours that made him a visitor in his own home, while Ethel ran an estate containing a dozen children and a rotating cast of staff essentially by herself, pregnant for most of it. The famous chaos read as joy in a magazine spread. Day to day, according to people who worked there, it ran closer to a ship with nobody at the wheel. Later accounts from staff and tradesmen, which reached the public filtered through that hostile 1994 biography and should therefore be held at arm's length, describe bills going unpaid for months, a revolving door of governesses and cooks, and a mistress of the house who could be generous in 1 hour and volcanic in the next. What nobody disputes is the arithmetic. Between 1951 and 1968, Ethel was pregnant 11 times, buried both parents and a brother, ran a 13-bedroom estate, and served as hostess for the most socially demanding household in Washington, while their husband prosecuted Jimmy Hoffa, ran the Justice Department, and belonged, in every hour that mattered, to his brother's administration. The legend says Bobby made it home for dinner. Sometimes he did. The legend leaves out how often dinner was the entire appearance. The ledger of that marriage was unbalanced in other ways, too, if you credit the whispers. So let us handle the whispers carefully, because this is where most tellings of this story fall apart. The Marilyn Monroe rumor, the one everybody has heard, is far weaker than its fame suggests. Serious biographers who went looking for it, Evan Thomas and Larry Tye among them, working from archives and hundreds of interviews, found no solid evidence that Bobby Kennedy had an affair with her. Several concluded the story grew out of a handful of documented meetings, inflated by conspiracy writers after both parties were safely dead and unable to object. Correcting that legend matters, because clearing it away makes room for something more credible and considerably more uncomfortable. Oppenheimer's sources, friends of Ethel speaking anonymously, claimed Bobby had other involvements, in one account following his brother's pattern with the wives of friends. Anonymous, interested, unconfirmed. But even the chroniclers most sympathetic to Ethel concede the essential asymmetry at the center of this marriage. She worshipped him with a totality he did not visibly return, and in that family, a wife's job description did not include asking questions about it. Whatever Bobby did or did not do in private, Ethel's public posture never moved by a millimeter. Either there was nothing to forgive, or forgiving in silence was simply one more duty on the list. The record cannot settle which, and anyone telling you the story honestly has to say so. What the record does show is the rivalry running quietly inside the sisterhood of Kennedy wives. Ethel and Jackie circled one another for years, the Earth Mother and the aesthete, and people around them later recalled Ethel mocking Jackie's breathy voice and grand manners, while privately smarting that Jackie had got the White House, the magazine covers, and the mystique. Those recollections arrived late and secondhand. The structural fact underneath them is solid enough. The family had exactly one queen's crown available, and Ethel, who had sacrificed more than anyone to belong, was never going to be the one wearing it. Then Dallas. November of 1963 did not simply kill a president. It came close to dissolving the man Ethel had built her entire life around. Bobby fell into a depression his biographers describe in unsparing terms, gaunt and withdrawn, wearing his dead brother's old coat, disappearing into grief for the better part of a year. And here is a private wound hiding inside a public tragedy, one that almost never makes it into the love story. The person who could reach him in that darkness was not always his wife. Contemporary accounts describe Bobby and the widowed Jackie bound together in mourning, sharing something Ethel could not enter. Her own faith made grief close to a theological error, since Jack was unquestionably in heaven, and mourning him too visibly implied a doubt about that. So she responded the only way she had ever been taught to respond. She kept the household loud and put the sorrow off limits. More activity, more children, a relentless campaign to get Bobby moving again. When he ran for the Senate from New York in 1964, she campaigned pregnant, and the machine restarted. The middle of that decade delivered two more blows to the family she no longer talked about. In September of 1966, her brother George Jr., by then running Great Lakes Carbon, died in a plane crash that eerily echoed their parents. Almost exactly a year after that, his widow choked to death during a meal at home. 4 Skakel deaths across 2 decades, and virtually none of it entered Ethel's public story, then or at any point afterwards. The Greenwich family went on generating tragedy and scandal for years, and eventually, a Skakel nephew would stand trial in one of the most notorious murder cases in the country. Ethel's particular genius, if that is the right word for it, was containment. She had learned inside a 31-room house full of secrets that you do not explain your family. You outrun it. Which brings us to the decision that ended everything, and to the most uncomfortable documented fact in the entire story. The 1968 campaign was substantially her doing. While Bobby agonized for months over whether to challenge a sitting president of his own party, his advisors split, and his brother Ted urged caution. Ethel pushed. Evan Thomas, who is nobody's idea of a sensationalist, described her as the most consistent advocate in Bobby's circle for a run at the White House. She teased him for hesitating. She invoked his dead brother. She wanted the crown that had gone to Jackie's husband, and she also believed, sincerely, that Bobby was the best hope the country had. Both of those things were true at the same time, and neither cancels the other. In March of 1968, he declared, and Ethel, pregnant with their 11th child, went out on the trail beside him, radiating the family circus image one more time for the cameras. For a few months, the marriage became what the myth had always claimed it was. 2 people fused into a single purpose, visibly happy, visibly effective. If you have been waiting for an answer to why she stayed through all of it, look at the spring of 1968. That partnership was real. That was the payoff. There is one night from that campaign worth holding on to. On the 4th of April, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and Bobby, against police advice, climbed onto a flatbed truck in a black neighborhood of Indianapolis and delivered, unscripted, one of the great speeches in American history. Ethel was with him on that trip, visibly pregnant, and the crowds in those weeks treated the two of them as a single organism, hands reaching for both, her wedding ring reportedly torn off more than once in the crush. After 17 years of waiting rooms and delivery rooms, she was finally standing inside the room where the history was being made. It lasted 11 weeks. On the 4th of June, 1968, Bobby won the California primary. Earlier that same day at Malibu, he had pulled their 12-year-old son David out of a dangerous undertow, a detail preserved in several accounts. Just after midnight, walking through the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel, he was shot. Ethel, 3 months pregnant, was a few steps behind him. The photograph taken on that kitchen floor, the one where she is kneeling with one hand raised to hold back the crowd, became one of the most famous images in American history within a matter of hours. What the cameras never showed was upstairs in the same hotel, where David was watching his father shooting live on television, alone, a few hours after his father had saved his life. Bobby died the following day. Oppenheimer later claimed the family quietly made the decision to withdraw life support once he was declared beyond recovery. The family has never discussed those hours, and that account remains his alone. 6 months later, on the 12th of December, Ethel gave birth to a daughter, Rory, whose father had been dead for half a year. The funeral applied the final coat of paint to the myth. 2 million people lined the tracks as the train carried Bobby's body from New York to Washington, and Ethel, weeks into a pregnancy and days into widowhood, walked the length of the cars thanking supporters one by one, a performance of composure that the reporters on board never forgot. It was genuinely brave. It was also the precise moment she took over the family business of grief, and from then on, she intended to run it her way. America expected the widow to disappear into black. What happened instead was harder and considerably stranger, and it is where the story most people know stops matching the story that actually occurred. Within months, Ethel helped establish the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial, the seed of what eventually became Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, and installed herself as the permanent keeper of his causes: migrant workers, Native American rights, the poor. In public, she was magnificent at it. In private, according to people inside Hickory Hill, the house tipped into something much darker. She refused, essentially forever, to talk about the assassination, not to reporters, and far more consequentially, not to her own children. Her sons later told interviewers, among them the biographers Peter Collier and David Horowitz, that their father's death was simply not a subject that could be raised at home. Grief went underground, exactly the way Skakel grief had always gone underground. The older boys spiraled into drugs, expulsions, and a long shuffle of boarding schools. Staff turnover became chronic. Oppenheimer's sources, hostile and unnamed as ever, said employees had a nickname for the estate that turned Hickory Hill into something out of a horror film, and accused her of rages and of shortchanging household workers. Those particular stories deserve the label they came with, which is allegations from an unauthorized book. The broader wreckage is not in dispute anywhere. David, the boy from the Malibu surf and the hotel television, died of a drug overdose in a Palm Beach hotel in April of 1984, aged 28, after years of addiction the family's official story had no room for. Michael died in a reckless skiing accident in 1997, months after a scandal of his own. Ethel buried 2 sons the way she had buried her parents, her brother, and her husband. Publicly composed, privately sealed. Inside the family, meanwhile, something quietly inverted. The second-choice sister-in-law became the moral center of gravity. With Jack and Bobby gone, Ethel's 11 children made her household the dynasty's future, and her approval began to matter in a way it never had while her husband was alive. When Chappaquiddick disgraced Ted in 1969, Oppenheimer's sources describe her as privately furious at the surviving brother for failing the standard her dead one had set. A late and interested account, but entirely consistent with everything else we know about how she ranked the men in that family. The Kennedys had absorbed her in 1950. By 1970, she was absorbing them. She never remarried, not once, across 56 years of widowhood. When the singer Andy Williams began escorting her to events in the 1970s, the gossip columns married them off repeatedly, and both of them maintained for decades that the friendship was platonic, with no evidence ever emerging to contradict it. In 1991, she gave People magazine the line that defined her second act, saying that remarrying would amount to adultery, and asking how she possibly could with Bobby looking down from heaven. You can hear that as pure devotion. You can also hear it as the final form of the bargain she struck in 1950. She had traded her own identity for the name, and widowhood was the last office that name was ever going to give her. She had no intention of resigning it. And here's the part almost nobody noticed while they were busy pitying her. After the assassination, the National Archives agreed to something extraordinary. It allowed Ethel Kennedy to take control of her husband's papers. Not the government, the widow. For more than 4 decades, dozens of boxes covering Bobby's years at the center of American power, including material touching the Cuban Missile Crisis, sat at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library under family control, and historians who wanted to read them had to ask the Kennedys for permission. Many asked, most waited. Scholars complained publicly for years that the fullest record of Robert Kennedy, and of this marriage, was effectively in the custody of the person with the largest stake in one particular version of it. Access, when it came selectively. Arthur Schlesinger, the same family friend who had gone into the Hickory Hill pool in his suit, was granted the papers for his affectionate 1978 biography, the one the family blessed. Writers the family trusted got in. Writers it did not trust waited, or worked around the edges. And every year of waiting hardened the love story version a little further into settled history. Substantial releases only began around 2012, timed to the 50th anniversary of the Missile Crisis, and even then, the family's fingerprints were on the process. Think about what that means. The woman remembered as the passive half of a great man's story spent half a century as the gatekeeper of that story's evidence. The girl who wrote a college thesis about the Kennedys in order to get in ended up deciding who else was permitted to study them. She curated the softer channels too, and this is where the whole thing finally becomes visible. The definitive film about her life, the 2012 documentary Ethel, was made by her own daughter Rory, the child born after the assassination, with Ethel's cooperation and on Ethel's terms. And in it, when the conversation approaches June of 1968, the 83-year-old matriarch simply declines. She waves the subject away, on camera, in her own daughter's film. The filmmakers left the refusal in the final cut, which suggests they understood something the rest of us took decades to work out. The silence was not a gap in the portrait. The silence was the portrait. 2 years after that, President Obama hung the Presidential Medal of Freedom around her neck. When she died in Boston on the 10th of October 2024, at 96, 3 presidents eulogized her, and the obituaries ran the kitchen photograph one more time, captioned with the love story. Her biographers have never agreed on what to make of her. Jerry Oppenheimer, working from hundreds of interviews with people who had grievances, produced a portrait of a snobbish and volatile woman who abandoned her own family and terrorized her staff. Arthur Schlesinger, writing with the family's blessing and the family's documents, produced a devoted partner in a heroic marriage. Evan Thomas and Larry Tye, working the archives, found something more interesting than either: a wife whose political influence on her husband was real and underestimated, and who pushed him toward the race that killed him. Peter Collier and David Horowitz, listening to the children, described a house where the cost of all that composure was quietly transferred to the next generation. Which verdict you find convincing depends almost entirely on which sources you were allowed to see, which is the most fitting thing about this entire story. The numbers are their own kind of argument. She married at 22 and was widowed at 40. 11 children in 17 years. 18 years of marriage against 56 years of widowhood, which means she spent more than 3 times as long being Bobby Kennedy's widow as she ever spent being his wife. She buried 2 parents, a brother, a sister-in-law, a husband, and 2 sons, and discussed almost none of it with anyone. So look at that photograph one last time, a kneeling woman with one hand raised. For 56 years, the country read that gesture as helplessness, a wife losing everything on a hotel floor. But follow what the hand actually did next. It took the papers. It built the foundation. It decided which questions her children were allowed to ask, which boxes historians were allowed to open, and which version of an 18-year marriage would survive as the official one. The second-choice courtship, the vanished Skakels, the absent husband, the rumors nobody could check, the sons who broke under the silence. None of that made the final cut. Go back to that ski slope in Quebec in 1945 and look at the 17-year-old standing at the edge of a family that had not noticed her yet. She learned one skill in Greenwich before she learned anything else, which was how to bury a family's truth and smile all the way through the funeral. She married into a dynasty that specialized in exactly the same thing, and in the end, she was better at it than they were. Bobby Kennedy got the martyrdom. Ethel got the archive. And the archive, not the marriage, is the thing she never let anybody touch. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching this video on Ethel Kennedy. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments. And if you have any suggestions for who I should cover next, also let me know down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next episode. Thanks.